Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever it is that you are and wherever you may be. Thank you very much for making this a part of your day. I am Brad Franklin, creative content right here in Chesterfield, and I'm very glad to tell you that Chesterfield Behind the Mic is on the air once again. The temperatures are starting to rise, and with that means spring is about to spring. It'll be sprung before we know it, and with that comes budget season. And we thought after last year's bond referendum and kind of doing some of these 101s, it wouldn't be a bad idea to sort of take a step back before we actually got into the nuts and bolts of the budget. I wanted to bring on a couple folks to kind of talk about what a budget is and kind of try to educate folks, give as much information as we can, fill in some holes, maybe fix some myths, misnomers, and that kind of thing. I've got Matt Harris, who is the Deputy County Administrator for Finance and Administration, or maybe Administration and Finance. Maybe I got those backwards. How are you, Matt?
Wonderful, Brad.
I appreciate you being on the show. Appreciate you coming in. And
this is my third time, actually. Is that the hat trick?
I think at this point you do get a T-shirt.
I do get the T-shirt,
but I'm not entirely sure what's on the T-shirt. We got maybe a logo. Maybe what if we had one with your face? Anyway, we also have Director of Budget and Management.
I'd like to hear more about that.
No, not right now. We've got Director of Budget Management Gerard Durkin on the show as well. Gerard, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. I appreciate your time, fellas. Obviously, this is a very busy time frame, but one of the things that I wanted to do in this podcast was to explain why this is not, I mean, yes, you're busy. I don't mean to imply that you're not. But it's not like the budget only starts in February, March. You guys are working on this thing all the time. And I kind of want to get into, like I said, the nuts and bolts of what is a budget, what is it not, how does it come together, who all's working on it. I think for a lot of people out there, Matt, the idea that the budget is just a guess. You know, it's a thing that just, pops up. But realistically, you guys are working on this in years in advance, multiple budgets probably at the same time. Let's start real basic. What is a budget? What is the operating budget, Matt? How would you define that if a resident walked up off the street and was asking you what it was?
It's simply just sort of our financial blueprint, and I think you brought it up in your open. It's sort of myth busting is sort of the session, and I think that's the first thing to pass along to folks is it's a living, breathing organism. It's not a plan we put on the shelf.
Right.
I think probably when I started, when I was a wee pup, 15 years ago, it kind of had that feel to it. We'd pass a 2-year budget, actually come out and do some amendments, and it wasn't really a responsive document or process, and I think over time it has evolved, and that's exactly what it is now. And the world around us, has changed a lot too. Just yesterday we had the revenue work session, and not to get turn this into super nerdy time, but you looked at all of the economic indicators that we follow on a day-to-day basis. You just noticed the incredibly wild swings that have occurred over the course of the last 18 to 24 months.
Right.
I think that just underscores, you can't build a budget that, is going to last 24 months, like we used to do, or, even the state's insane process, which, also doesn't really factor in those things. So we build a budget right now. We're beginning the process, really kind of start in January, ramps up in February, and 2 weeks from yesterday, we will be unveiling what people probably consider more to be the budget, the expense side, what's in this new financial plan, which for us in sort of X's and O's, basic 101s, our budget year begins on July the 1st.
Right.
So that's what we're working up towards. We do have to, other, myth busting. I like that theme you've got today, Brad.
Like that?
I do, yeah. We have to have a balanced budget, unlike our friends, a little bit further north near the Potomac, who have no idea what that term means. Ours has to be balanced. We have to have a budget in place by May the 1st. So the state that just likes to, dot along with theirs. We have very hard and fast deadlines and rules and processes that we have to comply by. So we will present the budget in March. Folks, the best time to interact, you could do it year round. We have phone numbers and websites and fax machines and carrier pigeons and all sorts of things that you could contact staff. But the month of March is really set aside to hear from the public about what is being presented. The board adopts it in April, and then, May 1st, again, is that deadline. And then, strike a midnight on June 30. We celebrate a weird New Year's, and it all becomes real things on
Right.
July 1st. So I mean, I think but your point is right. So those are kind of the traditional milestones, traditional places in the process. But we have had to. I mean, every month that the board meets, they do something to amend the budget.
Right.
And I think that's another part of it. Conditions change. That the biggest milestone of that is kind of in the fall once we close out the fiscal year from the prior year.
Right.
We have positive budgets here. We have surpluses at the end of the year by design. I mean, otherwise, I don't even know what that world looks like. We, be somewhere else, doing something else. But in the fall period of time when those one-time monies come back, the board has used that as an opportunity to deal with things that have come up, to modify plans. But more or less, you're right. It's a year-round process. Mm-hmm. Folks really tune into it more in the winter and spring months. But we have to, with the world around us, with all of the chaos that exists from external pressure perspective, we have to be on top of it, on a month-by-month basis.
Gerard, obviously, we can get into sort of the ins and outs of what's in the budget, and we will do that in another podcast that's coming up here very soon. But I'm curious, from your point of view, how far in advance do you start working on the next budget? Because and you correct me here if I'm wrong, but you guys typically work in multiple years at once. And how intricate is that process? And when do you really start to Matt's point, really start to gear up for the season that we're entering and somewhat in right now?
I mean, it is a year-round process. Kind of at 3 points, 3 fiscal years are kind of being juggled together. We're starting to ramp up for fiscal year 24 in the fall, where we start to talk to departments about what their upcoming needs are in the given year.
Right.
We're in the current fiscal year 23 right now, which definitely does inform where things may land for 24. And to Matt's point, we're beginning to close out fiscal year 22, and how can we best use those results of operations?
Right. So in terms of the budget kind of balancing act that you have to do, there is the piece of it that is revenues that come in, and let's kind of Fraggle Rock this a little bit. The county obviously has revenues that come in, a lot of that based around assessments, tax rate, which we obviously the board will set the rate, and there's a whole legal framework around the rate that you advertise. You can't go higher than that, but you can always go lower than that. But in terms of, let's say there's a department who has a need, who thinks that they have something that they want to be able to put in the budget. Usually that comes to you earlier than just this one budget cycle. But take me through sort of how how a bill becomes a law. How does a budget need, how does a department need become a funded part of the budget?
Well, mechanically, without getting into the weeds, they submit to us what we call additional funding requests, where they lay their case for why they need what they need.
Right.
We look at that internally. My department works with all the departments to review those, and then it really becomes, like I said before, an art and a science at that point.
Right.
You look at what are the priorities of the board, what are the priorities of the county administrator, and what are the priorities, most importantly, of the community.
Right.
And you have to factor all of those in when you're making those decisions. Every year, we get way more requests than we can actually afford to do, and that then becomes part of what you alluded to of the 5-year plan. That can begin the discussion of, okay, we may not be able to do this year given the constraints and pressures we have, but how can we work that in over this 5-year horizon?
Right. And in terms of the way that the thing kind of comes together, what's the hardest, like the pressure points, right? Is it revenue projections that the models are wrong about? Is it the revenue doesn't come from the state that you expect? Is it the uncertainty of just sort of what the priorities might be when you start to build the budget versus when the budget actually comes to adoption? What are some of the biggest pressures that the process sort of puts on you guys as you're trying to put it together?
Yeah, I don't think Gerard cared for that revenue forecasting crack.
It wasn't a crack. No shade. Just there's
that's a different podcast.
There's a lot of things of moving pieces, as we all learned through the pandemic, right? And in terms of, especially with inflation, I was just assuming, and my bad if I'm wrong about this, but the idea being that sometimes what you think might happen can change dramatically based on things that you don't necessarily that you can't forecast, right? There are some pieces, I mean, as all of us know, who are trying to, I didn't expect that eggs were going to be crazy expensive, and then all of a sudden not. Who knows?
You got those backyard chickens, Brad, when I told you.
But meanwhile, back at the ranch, what are some of the biggest pressures that sort of work on
the hardest part of this business is like Gerard said, we can sit downstairs with Excel spreadsheets all day and really get that dialed in. But it's the balancing the community expectations in a municipality of 370,000 people with a lot of growth, healthy growth. I think that's another kind of misnomer. I mean, we look at that as, that's a positive thing. I mean, it certainly isn't even across the county in terms of where that's occurring, but it's something that we have to factor in. So, a time like this when you mention eggs and other, household commodities, we're trying to balance the pressure that folks face on a day-to-day basis, kind of that kitchen table metaphor versus, the needs of a growing community. And then the fact that all of those inflationary pressures, we don't buy a whole lot of eggs as an organization, but we do, we are a people-intensive business, and all of our contracts have inflation clauses in them, and we have to, we don't get to just look at those folks and say, well, we can't, absorb. We have to, those costs get passed along to us like they do everybody else. So, how do you provide some relief when assessments are going up a lot? How do you continue to focus on the needs of a growing community, a growing organization, and just kind of deal with rising cost pressures, that we're facing? So, I mean, it's that list of what the pressures are always changes a little bit, but I think those are the balls that we're trying to juggle right now.
Gerard, when you work year to year, budget to budget, are there things that you sort of learn from one year to the next? This is a tweak we need to make, and then you sort of track it going forward? Or is it all about sort of the projections that, that I apparently impugned there a minute ago? Is it all really about sort of making sure that the knowns stay known and the unknowns are things you're trying to figure out? How would you kind of describe the process of year to year? Like, what changes year to year? Obviously some of the numbers might change, but I'm talking about from a structural standpoint. Do you learn
still seething, Brad?
I know he's still angry at me. Do you learn a lot, I guess is the question I'm trying to ask, from budget to budget, and tweak things as you go forward?
I mean, there's always new stuff to learn as you build these budgets. I mean, we have core things that we do every year.
Right.
To Matt's point, we are a kind of people-intensive business. We have to compete with other employers out there. So we look at things like merit increases, we look at things like health insurance, those kind of things that everybody has in their day-to-day life.
Right.
But every year something comes up that you just can't anticipate, and you have to factor it in as best as you can. That could be things like the pandemic.
Right.
We had a plan, and I think it was like a day later that we had to basically rip it up and start again.
Built 2 budgets in a week, essentially.
Wow.
But I mean, I think
the time frame of that would have been pretty.
It was brutal.
Yeah.
But the lesson from COVID for us is max flexibility in the budget. I mean, and you're going to see that when we come back and when we in this room on March 8th. You're going to see a design that I think is very, we've had the 5-year plan that gives us horizontal flexibility, if you will. We can go and take something and cut it up and put it in multiple years. Mm-hmm. I think that's been very useful because, if you get caught in a turn, upturn down there, or whatever it might be, you haven't packed all of those costs into a single year. So we have, I would say, mastered the art of sort of the horizontal budget. Now we're going to do that vertically, and that we're going to look at the fiscal year not as a full 12-month block, but as 6-month increments, and flipping on switches in 6-month increments as revenues become apparent to us, because we are at a distinct disadvantage with that. So this is sort of the weird, just humor me for a second, Brad. I'll defend Gerard's revenue record, which is
I love that. That's going to be the takeaway from the show, is that I impugn Gerard's
he has a large following. They're going to come after you. But from a revenue forecasting, right? So our budget begins July the 1st. So we know but the tax year is calendar year. So for this upcoming July 1st, we know the first 6 months of real estate values. That's locked in. The assessor's done his work. The board will pick a rate. That creates the bill. But by and large, we know what we're going to get in for that first 6 months of that fiscal year.
Right.
We have no idea what's going to happen no idea. I mean that's what you said, Brad.
You're impugning my record too.
Yeah.
See, look, everybody taking shots at Gerard for no apparent reason, huh?
That second half of this budget we're talking about is based on market activity of the next 8 to 10 months. So that's something we have to factor in. Personal property, we are just now putting together the billing that will happen in this budget that is due June 5th of this year.
Right.
So we're just finalizing those numbers, and then we're trying to project on top of that for a year from now, a full 12 months or more.
Right.
Personal property is the noisiest revenue. I mean, if you had financial troubles today, Brad, I'm not suggesting you
Thank
might.
you for putting that on me, Ricky Bobby.
But you could go out and trade your car in, get rid of a car,
right.
downsize, whatever. I mean, it's a very, with your house, you don't have that. So personal property is very, very...
It fluctuates a lot.
Exactly. Right. So we're dealing with those, those are our two main revenue sources. That's more than 2/3 of, what keeps the lights on here. And they just come at weird times in the process. So we were trying to design the expense side to really match up with that so that we are not putting out an expense plan against that, sort of revenue picture where you don't have all pieces of the puzzle when you want them, so to make sure we can still move the ball forward, but do it in a more incremental fashion. So again, vertical budgeting this year, we've got the horizontal in place, and I think that gives us as much flexibility as anybody in the business.
Yeah. Gerard, I want to come back to you. First, I want to apologize in case you were actually but no, I think one of the things we're trying to do with this show is really kind of get at the myths and sort of that myth busting. But I'm curious from your point of view, what have your over the years, what are some of the misnomers, things that people think about the budget process or about the budget itself that you just find to just not be the case? Are there any sort of like conventional wisdoms out there? Including me, who I think I assumed that like the models were like software based and not necessarily like human based. So that's why I said what I said. But that's a perfect example, right? Regular folks who don't work with budgets, what kind of things do we think are real that just aren't necessarily the way it works?
Well, I think, first of all, I do have to defend the revenue forecast models that we have. To your point, there's different ways of doing that. We do take a very kind of like data-driven approach as a kind of first part. We look at a lot of variables out there. Mm-hmm. That's especially important in the kind of economic situation that we're in right now. Right. But there is the kind of, nuances and personal experiences that you look at, and how do they kind of like lay out what the revenues could be.
Okay.
The other part is, at this time of the year in particular emphasis is placed on certain parts of the organization. Right. But there are over 50 departments that are part of this organization. Right. It runs the gamut from public safety to libraries to parks to utilities. Right. And it's a big operation. Right. That, and I have to, give credit to the team downstairs. Right. They juggle all of those things every day behind the scenes. Right. They're kind of like the unsung heroes of this whole process.
Cool. While you to that point, real quick, you mentioned the team. How many folks?
10.
So it's a group of 10 that puts together this thing in large part, doing a lot of the on the ground sort of work that goes into it. Before we wrap up, I kind of want to give you both a chance to kind of speak to some final thoughts if you have them. But my last sort of question, and I want to ask this of both of you, what are some of the key messages you want folks to take away from the work that you do? Matt, we'll start with you, and then we'll let Gerard go, and then we'll close it out.
It's the last word.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, you can pack it all. I mean, basically, it's whatever we want it to be, right? But I'm just curious, what are some of the sort of takeaways for folks about the budget process that you want people to sort of understand before we get into what's actually in this year's FY budget proposal? I'm just curious, what are some of the things you want people to understand about the process?
Yeah, well, I think 2 or 3 things, Brad, maybe 10. First and foremost, there's this every January, it's sort of a weird thing. The school budgets present first, and to no fault of their own. I mean, that's the way the process has to happen. Right. The school board has to have, I think they're approving a budget incentive of the county administrator today, actually. But, they go through this concept of a needs-based budget where, these are all the things that they need for the upcoming year. And then that creates a lot of emotional excitement in the community. I I think there's a misnomer that doesn't happen on the county side. We have, we're getting ready to produce a 400-page budget document. Mm-hmm. So that's another, message to folks. There's nothing that you can't see. I mean, the level of transparency from when we started, doing this several years ago is just unbelievable. You can any line item that you want to look at, you can see. But we get 2, 3, 4 times the amount of requests from departments than we can actually reasonably ask the public to pay for in any given year. And again, that's why we go out in that horizontal concept. So there are quote unquote unmet needs on both sides in every budget that has ever been produced. And I think our process on the county side isn't quite as noisy about things that aren't in this budget because departments, even public safety, very high important things that are very, very important to everyone. Mm-hmm. They get deferred into year 2, 3, 4, and they just kind of understand that. The school process is a little bit different. So I think that, that's important. But most important is again, the theme of this whole year has been trust the process. The state really makes our lives difficult with their recent inability to pass a budget in a way that's in a timeline that's meaningful for us.
Right. And that throws your entire process into a little bit of chaos.
It does. And so the general government side, we don't rely a whole lot on the state. We don't really, to your point on revenue estimates, we take those with a grain of salt. Schools is about a 50-50 proposition. They don't have that luxury. They have to be able to have an accurate and timely state number to plug in. That creates chaos, and the state doesn't feel that. We feel it here, and the fingers and the handouts and everything else gets pointed back to the board of supervisors, and that's unfair because we don't have a state number yet. It's hard. The board doesn't even know what gap they're really trying to work towards. Right. To talk about accuracy, we gave schools, the school board, school admin, all those folks 18 months ago a number that we could hit, and we hit it. And we are working actively from the direction of the board of supervisors to help fill in whatever gaps remain after the state finishes their work, but we just don't know when that's going to be. Right. So I think just people need to keep that in mind. It's not that the board won't fund this, that, or the other thing. It's like, what are they responding to? They don't even have an official submission to vote up or down.
It'd be like a household trying to make a budget for itself, not knowing how much money they're going to bring in.
Right.
I mean, that's the bottom line, right?
Yeah, we got half of the revenue picture, a lot of expenses, and you can't match those up. So, but we have been able to give them a very clear path. We say we know we can hit this number. We think we might be able to do better. Once again, that revenue picture where all those things come in at different periods. I like wake up one day and we get a letter from the revenue fairy and here's all the numbers. It doesn't work that way. So we have to rely on the process. That's where we are. April 5th. Board's voting on this thing. Hopefully the state gives us something to work for. But I think I just ask for the public's patience, stay engaged. If you have questions, if something doesn't sound right, call one of us. All of our information's out there, emails, however we can fill in those gaps for folks. But I think until you get into sort of mid-March, late March, and April, that's when we really have to dive in. To make a judgment or an assessment on what is or isn't in a budget in the middle of January is just not gonna
work.
Yeah, not gonna work very well.
All right, Gerard, you can carry us out here. What are some of the things you want folks to take away from it, and what are some of your final thoughts?
I think first of all that my new nickname should be the Revenue Fairy, based on what Matt just said. I like that.
I want that on my T-shirt. Actually,
that's what you want, huh? Revenue Fairy. Okay.
I mean, honestly, I think he covered like the operational and the kind of public side extremely well. I think just for me, I'll come back to the team again. A lot of them live and work in this community. They care about this community a hell of a lot, and they work day and night to produce that budget and work with all the departments throughout the year.
Well, guys, I really appreciate the time. I really appreciate you talking me through the budget. We'll be back again here very soon to do it all over again. But thank you very much for joining us.
Thank
you, Brad.
Now, make sure you check us out on social media. On Twitter, it's at Chesterfield VA, and on Instagram, it's Chesterfield Virginia, all one word. And on Facebook, you can check out our podcast page. Just search Chesterfield Behind the Mic. Make sure you like that page and keep us as we go forward. Now, let me tell you about all the ways you can check us out. You can watch us on our YouTube channel as well as on our website at chesterfield.gov/podcast. An audio-only version of the show is available there, as well as on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Overcast, and a whole host of other services. You can watch the show on WCCT Thursday through Sunday at 7, on the weekends at noon. That's Comcast Channel 98 and Verizon Channel 28. And lastly, you can check out chesterfield.gov/connect with us for more ways to get in touch with us and for us to get in touch with you. My thanks to our director, Martin Stith, our executive producer, Teresa, Bonifas, and all the good folks here in communications and media for all that they do. We very much appreciate them. So from all of us here in Chesterfield County, thanks again for making us a part of your day. We'll see you again real soon. Take good care.